"Get back in line right now, or I will have you removed," Emily Carter said, her voice sharp enough to cut through the roar of the airport terminal, not knowing that the man she had just scolded controlled every aircraft that touched the sky above her. The line at Gate 42 stretched nearly 50 feet, curling past tired families, business travelers in pressed suits, and restless children clutching backpacks. Emily stood behind the counter, her navy uniform slightly wrinkled from a double shift, her feet aching inside shoes that had lost their support months ago. She had already dealt with 3 angry passengers, 1 delayed flight, and a supervisor who reminded her twice that she was replaceable. So when the tall man in a dark coat stepped past everyone without a word, something inside her snapped. He did not look rushed. He did not look apologetic. He simply moved as if the world would rearrange itself for him. Emily leaned forward, blocking his path with a firm hand against the counter. Her heart pounded, but her voice did not shake. "Sir, there is a line. You do not get to skip it." Around them, conversations faded. A woman near the front lowered her phone. A man in a suit glanced up, then quickly looked away. The stranger stopped. Slowly, he turned his head toward Emily. For a moment, everything felt wrong. The fluorescent lights above flickered, just once. The air grew colder, as if the automatic doors had opened in winter. His eyes settled on her, pale and unreadable, like storm clouds frozen in time. He did not argue. He did not apologize. He simply looked at her, and something ancient and heavy pressed into the silence between them. Emily forced herself not to step back. She had dealt with worse. Rich men who thought rules did not apply to them. Travelers who yelled, threatened, and tried to intimidate. This was no different. It could not be. "Line starts back there," she said again, pointing. The man followed her gesture with his gaze, then returned his attention to her. A faint, almost invisible shift passed through the people nearby. One by one, they began to move aside, not out of courtesy, but out of instinct, as if their bodies understood something their minds did not. Emily frowned. That was new. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. The man took one step closer. Not aggressive, not hurried, just deliberate. Close enough now that Emily could see the fine detail of his coat, perfectly tailored, untouched by the chaos of travel, and the subtle stillness in his posture, like a predator that had never known fear. "You are telling me to wait," he said, his voice low and calm, carrying easily over the distant announcements and rolling suitcases. It was not a question. Emily swallowed, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Everyone waits. Another pause. Somewhere behind him, a security officer had started toward them, then stopped abruptly, as if unsure whether to interfere. A man in an expensive suit near the front lowered his head slightly, his shoulders tense. Emily noticed it now. The silence was spreading, unnatural, heavy, like the entire terminal was holding its breath. The stranger studied her face, searching, measuring. And for the first time since he had arrived, something changed in his expression. Not anger, not annoyance. Interest. "Everyone," he repeated softly. Emily held his gaze, refusing to look away. "Everyone," she said. And in that moment, without realizing it, she had just made herself the only person in the entire airport who had ever told him no. Emily Carter did not move even after the silence settled over the terminal like a weight pressing against her chest. Because if she stepped back now, she would lose more than just this moment. She would lose the last piece of herself that still believed rules mattered, that fairness meant something, that people like her were allowed to stand their ground even when the world tried to push them aside. And she had spent too many years being overlooked, too many nights counting every dollar just to afford rent in a small apartment 30 minutes from the airport, too many mornings waking before sunrise to catch the employee shuttle just to start another shift where no one remembered her name, only her mistakes. So she held her position, fingers curled slightly against the edge of the counter, shoulders squared even as the cold in the air made her skin prickle, and she told herself that this man, no matter how composed, no matter how strange the reaction around him felt, was still just another passenger who needed to follow the same rules as everyone else. Because if she let one person break them, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of her standing there for 10 hours a day enforcing policies that people richer and louder than her tried to ignore? What was the point of her supervisor reminding her that customer complaints could cost her job when no one ever protected her from the way she was spoken to, the way she was dismissed, the way she was expected to smile through everything. And she remembered her mother's voice from years ago, soft but firm, telling her that dignity was not something anyone could hand to her. It was something she had to hold on to even when it felt small and fragile, even when it felt like it did not matter. And that memory steadied her now as she looked directly at the man in front of her, refusing to be intimidated by the quiet intensity in his gaze, refusing to acknowledge the subtle shift happening around them, where people who had been impatient only moments ago now stood unnaturally still, their conversations fading into uneasy whispers, their eyes flicking toward him and then away as if looking too long might invite something they did not understand. And Emily noticed a woman clutching her boarding pass tighter, noticed a man slowly stepping back without realizing he had moved, noticed even the overhead announcements seemed distant, like they were coming from another place entirely. And yet she forced herself to focus on what she could control, on the simple truth in front of her, a line of passengers waiting their turn and one man who had not. And she spoke again, this time calmer but no less firm, explaining the boarding process, the priority groups, the need to respect the order, because this was her job, and she would do it properly no matter who stood in front of her, even if something deep inside her was beginning to whisper that this situation was not normal, that the way the air felt, the way the people reacted, the way this man watched her with a stillness that felt almost impossible, was not something she could explain with logic alone. But she pushed that thought aside because she could not afford to believe in things she could not control. She could barely control her own life as it was, working 2 jobs, sending money back home when she could, skipping meals some weeks just to make sure her younger brother had what he needed for school. And she thought about the rent due in 3 days, about the warning email from management about employee conduct, about how one complaint from the wrong person could end everything she had built here. And yet even with all of that pressing down on her, she did not step aside, because something in her refused to bend, something quiet but unbreakable. And as she stood there facing a man who seemed untouched by the chaos of the world around him, she had no idea that this small act of defiance, this simple insistence on fairness, had just drawn the attention of someone who had not been challenged in centuries, someone who did not exist within the rules she was trying so hard to protect. And somewhere deep beneath that calm exterior, something ancient had just begun to awaken, not in anger, not in offense, but in something far more dangerous, recognition. The man did not move aside, and he did not repeat himself, but something in the way he stood there shifted the entire space around him, as if the terminal itself had begun to recognize his presence long before Emily ever could. And while she saw only a passenger refusing to follow the rules, there were others in that building who understood exactly who stood before her and what it meant that he had been stopped. Because Lucien Vale was not a man who waited in lines. Not now, not ever, not in the 300 years since he had first walked among human cities under borrowed names and carefully constructed identities, building an empire that stretched far beyond what any airline, corporation, or government could fully comprehend. And though the world above ground believed that commercial aviation was controlled by boards, shareholders, and regulatory agencies, the truth existed in quieter places, in sealed contracts signed under conditions no human fully understood, in night routes that never appeared on public schedules, in private airspace corridors that bent around invisible authority, all of it ultimately answering to one name that was never spoken aloud in the presence of those who wished to remain alive. Lucien Vale, the unseen architect of the skies, the one who decided which aircraft moved freely and which were delayed without explanation, the one whose influence ensured that certain flights always arrived exactly when they were meant to and others vanished from records entirely. And as he stood in front of Emily Carter, dressed in a simple dark coat that concealed more than it revealed, there was nothing outwardly remarkable about him to the untrained eye, no badge of authority, no visible sign of the power he carried, only the subtle impossibility of his stillness, the way the noise of the terminal seemed to bend around him, the way the air cooled just enough to make those nearby uneasy without understanding why. But beneath that controlled exterior was something ancient and watchful, a mind that had observed centuries of human behavior, of greed, fear, loyalty, and betrayal, and had long ago grown indifferent to most of it, Because humans were predictable, easily swayed, easily broken, easily ignored. And yet the woman standing in front of him did not follow that pattern, did not lower her gaze, did not rush to apologize or step aside when confronted with pressure. Instead, she held her ground with a quiet defiance that did not come from arrogance, but from something far rarer, a belief that rules applied equally to everyone, even him. And that alone was enough to hold his attention in a way nothing else in that terminal could. Because in all his years moving through the human world, he had learned to expect compliance long before confrontation, deference, long before resistance. And when resistance did appear, it was almost always driven by fear or desperation, never by principle, never by something as simple and stubborn as fairness. And so as Emily spoke, explaining procedures and policies with a steadiness that betrayed none of the tension gathering around them, Lucien listened not to her words but to the intent behind them, to the rhythm of her heartbeat, steady despite the unnatural pressure filling the air, to the absence of calculation in her expression, no attempt to assess his status or guess at his importance. Only the clear and unwavering expectation that he would follow the same rules as everyone else. And that was what unsettled him, not because it threatened his authority, but because it contradicted everything he had come to understand about humans. And somewhere deep within that ancient, controlled existence, something shifted, something he had not felt in a very long time. Not interest in the superficial sense, not curiosity born of boredom, but a deeper recognition, as if a pattern long forgotten had suddenly reappeared in front of him in the most unexpected place, in the form of a woman who should have been insignificant, who should have blended into the endless flow of faces he passed every day, and yet did not. And around them the invisible network that served him continued to respond. Security personnel hesitating without knowing why, airport staff exchanging uncertain glances, and a figure near the edge of the boarding area lifting a phone only to lower it again when Lucien did not even look in his direction. Because those who truly understood power did not need to see it displayed to feel it. And still Emily Carter stood there, unaware that the man she was instructing to return to the back of the line was not merely important, not merely wealthy, but something far beyond the systems she worked within, something that did not exist on any employee handbook or training manual, something that had shaped the very structure of the world she depended on. And as Lucien continued to watch her, silent and unmoving, the decision forming in his mind was not whether he would comply or refuse, but something far more consequential. Whether this moment, this brief and ordinary confrontation, would end like all others, forgotten and insignificant, or whether the woman in front of him had just altered the course of something much larger than either of them could yet see. Emily Carter felt the shift before she understood it, a subtle tightening in the air as if the moment itself had narrowed into something precise and irreversible. And for the first time since she had spoken, a quiet awareness crept into her thoughts that this situation was no longer just about a line, no longer just about policy or procedure, because the man in front of her had not reacted the way anyone else would have. He had not argued, had not shown irritation, had not even attempted to assert status in the way she had come to expect from difficult passengers. Instead, he had simply watched her, and that stillness carried a weight that made her instincts stir in warning even as she tried to ignore it. And yet she did not step aside. Because stepping aside would mean admitting that something about him placed him above the rules, and that was something she refused to accept, not after everything she had endured to stand where she was, not after every moment she had swallowed her pride just to keep her job. And so she held her position as the seconds stretched, long enough for the tension to draw attention from beyond the immediate crowd, long enough for someone in a pressed uniform to begin moving quickly through the terminal toward them. A supervisor who had been monitoring the boarding process from across the gate area and had suddenly realized that something was very wrong, because the silence alone was unnatural, but the way people were reacting, the way trained staff were hesitating instead of intervening, that was something far more serious. And as he approached, his expression shifted from irritation to confusion to something dangerously close to fear when his eyes landed on the man Emily was blocking. Because recognition came not from a badge or a name being spoken, but from an instinct sharpened by experience, the kind that told him immediately that this was not a situation he had been trained to handle. And yet Emily remained unaware of that recognition as she spoke again, reiterating boarding order, maintaining professionalism even as her pulse quickened. And then, finally, the man moved. Not backward as she had instructed, but forward, closing the small distance between them, until he stood just on the other side of the counter, close enough that she could feel the cold that seemed to follow him, close enough that the faint scent of something unfamiliar, something older than the artificial air of the terminal, brushed against her senses, and he placed one hand lightly on the edge of the counter, not gripping, not demanding, simply resting there as if claiming the space without effort. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm weight as before, but now, there was something beneath it, something deliberate. "And if I choose not to wait," he said, and it was not a challenge spoken in anger. It was a question that did not expect refusal, and for a brief moment, Emily hesitated, not because she intended to back down, but because something in the way he asked it felt different, as if the answer mattered more than the situation itself. And behind her the supervisor finally reached the counter, breath slightly uneven, eyes fixed not on Emily but on the man, and when he spoke his voice lacked the authority it usually carried, replaced by something strained and careful. "Miss Carter," he said, too quickly, too tightly. "Step aside, please." And Emily turned slightly, confusion flashing across her face, because this was not protocol. This was not how they handled line disputes. And she shook her head almost instinctively. "Sir, he needs to wait like everyone else," she said, unaware that the words landed far differently than she intended. Because the moment they left her mouth, the supervisor's expression changed completely, color draining from his face as if she had just said something forbidden, something that should never have been spoken aloud in this context. And he stepped closer, lowering his voice urgently. "Emily, move," he repeated, but now there was fear there. Unmistakable and real, and that was what unsettled her more than anything else, because she had never seen him afraid, not of passengers, not of complaints, not of anything. And as she looked between the two men, trying to understand what she was missing, the man in front of her remained perfectly still, watching her, waiting, not for compliance, but for her decision. And in that suspended moment, with the weight of expectation pressing in from all sides, Emily Carter stood at the edge of something she could not yet see, a choice that seemed simple on the surface, step aside or stand her ground. But beneath it lay consequences that neither her training nor her experience could prepare her for, because the man she was refusing was not bound by the system she believed in, and the path she chose in the next few seconds would determine whether she remained part of the world she understood or was pulled into something far beyond it. Emily Carter did not step aside. Not immediately, because the fear in her supervisor's voice confused her more than it convinced her, and confusion, for someone who had spent her life navigating uncertainty, often translated into resistance rather than compliance. So she held her ground for one more second, then another, long enough for the silence around them to deepen into something unnatural, something that seemed to press against her ears until even the distant sound of rolling suitcases. And overhead, announcements faded into a dull echo, and it was then that she noticed it clearly. The way the air itself felt different near him, colder, not like the artificial chill of an overworked air conditioning system, but something deeper, something that carried a stillness with it, as if time slowed just slightly in his presence, and her breath caught without her understanding why, a small involuntary reaction that she immediately tried to suppress. But it was not just her, because the passengers closest to them had begun to shift in subtle ways, stepping back not with visible panic, but with quiet instinct, creating space around the man without being told, without even seeming aware that they were doing it. And a child who had been fidgeting moments before now stood completely still, eyes wide, watching with a kind of silent curiosity that bordered on unease, and even the electronic display above the gate flickered briefly, the departure time blinking once before stabilizing again, a small glitch that no one commented on, but that added to the growing sense that something about this moment was not entirely real, and Emily felt it in her chest, a tightening that made it harder to draw a full breath, as if the atmosphere itself had thickened, and yet the man in front of her remained unchanged, his posture relaxed, his expression calm, as though none of it affected him at all, as though this shift in the environment was not something happening around him, but something happening because of him. And that thought, once it formed, refused to leave her mind, because it did not fit with anything she understood, did not align with any logical explanation she could grasp, and for the first time since the confrontation began, doubt flickered through her certainty, not about the rule she was enforcing, but about the situation itself, about whether she was truly seeing everything clearly and behind her. Her supervisor moved closer still, his hand hovering near her arm as if he wanted to pull her back but was afraid to make sudden contact, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Emily, please," he said. And the word please was what finally broke through her stubborn resolve, because she had never heard him say it before, not to her, not to anyone, and it carried a weight that no command could have matched, and slowly, reluctantly, she shifted half a step to the side, not fully yielding but enough to open a narrow space at the counter, and as she did, the man's gaze remained fixed on her, not in triumph, not in irritation, but in quiet observation, as if this small movement held more significance than the entire exchange that had come before it. And when he finally moved again, it was not with urgency or force, but with the same deliberate calm that defined everything about him, stepping forward into the space she had created, his presence passing close enough that the cold followed in his wake, brushing against her skin like a fleeting shadow, and for a fraction of a second, their proximity shifted something deeper, something she could not name, a faint and unsettling awareness that lingered just beneath the surface of her thoughts, and she turned slightly as he moved past, watching him now not as just another passenger, but as something she could not quite place, and around them the tension did not immediately dissolve. It lingered, stretched thin across the terminal like a thread waiting to snap, because those who had witnessed the exchange understood, in ways Emily did not yet, that what had just happened was not a simple disagreement resolved. It was the beginning of something far more significant, a disruption in a pattern that had remained unchanged for longer than any of them could comprehend. And as the man reached the front of the line and placed his attention on the boarding process as if nothing unusual had occurred, the world around him slowly began to move again. Conversations returning in cautious fragments, footsteps resuming, announcements regaining their clarity, but the memory of that cold, that silence, that invisible pressure remained, settling into the space like a warning that had not yet been fully understood, and Emily Carter stood behind the counter, her hands steady but her thoughts no longer as certain as they had been, because somewhere, deep within her, a quiet realization had begun to take shape, that she had just encountered something beyond the ordinary, something that did not follow the rules she relied on, and whatever it was, it had noticed her in return. The moment Lucien Vale stepped to the front, the invisible hierarchy of the terminal revealed itself without a single word being spoken, because those who recognized him did not need confirmation, they felt it, and within seconds the subtle signals began to move through the space like a quiet chain reaction. A security officer near the boarding lane straightened and lowered his gaze. A gate agent from another counter suddenly turned away, as if avoiding direct sight. And even the supervisor behind Emily Carter shifted his stance, his posture no longer authoritative but cautious, deferential in a way that made no sense within the normal structure of airport operations, and Emily noticed it now with growing unease. The way trained professionals who had always carried themselves with confidence were suddenly unsure, their movements restrained, their voices lowered, as though they were in the presence of someone who existed outside their authority. And she watched as Lucien reached into the inner pocket of his coat and produced a simple boarding pass, no special markings, no visible indication of priority status. Yet the moment he placed it on the counter, the scanner in front of her flickered again, the screen dimming for a fraction of a second before returning to normal, and when she picked it up her fingers hesitated, not because she saw anything unusual printed on it, but because something about it felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried a weight that had nothing to do with paper or ink, and she forced herself to proceed, scanning it with the same efficiency she used for every passenger, expecting the usual confirmation tone, but instead the system paused, the loading symbol spinning longer than it ever had before, and behind her the supervisor's breath caught audibly, a small sound that he immediately tried to hide, and then the screen changed, not to an error, not to a delay notice, but to something she had never seen in her entire time working there. A blank authorization field followed by a single line of text that read cleared without any accompanying data. No seat number, no boarding group, no restrictions, just cleared. And before she could question it, the gate mechanism beside her unlocked with a soft click on its own, the barrier sliding open as if responding to a command she had not given, and she looked up sharply, her eyes meeting Lucien's again, searching for an explanation that he did not offer, because he simply watched her with that same calm intensity, as if this was expected, as if the system she relied on were merely extensions of something far greater that he controlled without effort. And behind him, a man who had been waiting in line took a step forward instinctively, only to stop abruptly when one of the security officers placed a hand out in silent warning, shaking his head ever so slightly. And the message was clear even if no words were spoken. Not now, not before him. And Emily felt the shift fully then, the realization settling into her chest that this was no longer a normal interaction, that whatever authority governed this place was bending in response to the man in front of her, not in visible obedience, but in quiet alignment, and her mind raced to find a rational explanation, a high-level executive, a government official, someone with clearance beyond her understanding, but none of those explanations fit the way people were reacting, the way the air felt, the way even the machines seemed to hesitate before responding, and as Lucien stepped forward through the opened gate, he paused just long enough to glance back at her, not with warning, not with gratitude, but with something far more unsettling, acknowledgement, as if he had marked her presence, as if this encounter had not ended with his passage through the line, but had only just begun. And then he continued on without another word, disappearing into the boarding corridor that led toward the aircraft, leaving behind a terminal that slowly began to breathe. Again, conversations rising cautiously, movements resuming with forced normalcy, but the tension did not fully disappear. It lingered in the glances exchanged between staff, in the way the supervisor wiped his forehead with a trembling hand, in the way the security officers remained unusually alert, and Emily Carter stood frozen for a moment behind the counter, her training telling her to move on, to continue boarding the next passenger, but her instincts telling her that something fundamental had just shifted, that the world she thought she understood had revealed a crack, and through that crack she had glimpsed something vast, something hidden, something that now, for reasons she could not yet comprehend, had turned its attention toward her. The moment Lucien Vale disappeared into the boarding corridor, the illusion of normalcy shattered completely, because what had just happened could not be undone by routine, and the people who had witnessed it understood that something far beyond standard protocol had taken place, even if they could not fully explain it. And Emily Carter felt the shift most sharply in the way her supervisor turned toward her, not with the usual irritation or authority she had come to expect, but with a pale, strained expression that carried something far more serious, something closer to alarm. And for a few seconds he did not speak at all, as if he needed to choose his words carefully, as if saying the wrong thing might make the situation worse. And when he finally did speak, his voice was low, tight. "Do you have any idea who that was?" he asked, and Emily blinked, still trying to steady her thoughts, still trying to process what she had just seen, and she shook her head slowly, because the truth was she did not really, not beyond the growing certainty that he was not just another passenger. And her supervisor exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face as if he could wipe away the tension that clung to him. And then he leaned closer, lowering his voice even further. "That was Lucien Vale," he said, and the name alone seemed to carry weight, because the moment he spoke it, one of the nearby staff members stiffened, glancing over quickly before looking away again, and Emily frowned slightly, the name unfamiliar to her, but the reaction around it unmistakable. "Who?" she asked quietly, and that was when the supervisor looked at her in a way he never had before. A mixture of disbelief and something almost like fear. "He owns the airline," he said, then hesitated, correcting himself almost immediately. "No, not just this airline. All of them. Everything connected to them. Routes, contracts, private airspace, you name it. If it flies, it answers to him." And Emily stared at him, trying to make sense of that, trying to fit it into a reality she understood. But it sounded impossible, exaggerated, like something out of a rumor or an urban legend. And yet, Nothing about what had just happened felt exaggerated. Nothing about the way the system had responded, the way the gate had opened, the way people had moved, could be explained by ordinary influence. And before she could respond, before she could ask more, another voice cut in from behind them. Sharp and urgent. You stopped him. And Emily turned to see a security officer standing just a few feet away. His expression tense, his eyes fixed on her, as if she had done something far more serious than breaking protocol. And she hesitated, then nodded slowly, because there was no point denying it, not after everything that had just unfolded. And the officer let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. No one stops him, he said, not accusing, not angry, just stating a fact that carried an unsettling finality. And that was when it truly hit her. Not just that the man she had confronted was powerful, but that he was the kind of powerful people did not question, the kind that existed outside the normal rules, the kind that people learned to avoid rather than challenge. And a cold realization settled into her chest as she replayed the moment in her mind, the way she had spoken to him, the way she had refused to step aside, the way she had insisted he follow the same rules as everyone else. And suddenly the memory felt different, heavier, as if she had crossed a line she had not even known existed. And her supervisor straightened slightly, glancing toward the boarding corridor as if expecting something else to happen, something worse. But nothing did, not immediately. And that silence, that lack of immediate consequence, was almost more unsettling than any reaction could have been, because it left the question hanging in the air, what now? And Emily felt it in the way people looked at her, quick glances filled with curiosity, concern, even a hint of disbelief, as if they were trying to understand how she was still standing there, still behind the counter, still part of the ordinary world after what she had just done. And she swallowed, her throat dry, her thoughts racing as she tried to decide what this meant for her job, for everything. But before she could reach any conclusion, the supervisor spoke again, more controlled now, but no less serious. You need to be careful, he said, his voice steady but quiet. Because if he noticed you, and I am telling you right now that he did, then this is not over. And Emily looked toward the corridor where Lucien had disappeared, her heart beating just a little faster, because deep down, beneath the confusion and the uncertainty, she knew he was right. This was not over, not even close, and whatever had begun in that moment at the counter was only just starting to unfold. Emily Carter tried to return to her routine, because routine was the only thing that had ever kept her steady, the only structure that made long shifts and difficult days manageable. But nothing felt the same anymore, not the sound of boarding passes scanning, not the rhythm of passengers stepping forward, not even the weight of the counter beneath her hands, because everything now existed under the shadow of what she had just learned, that the man she had confronted was not simply powerful, but untouchable in a way that did not belong to the normal world. And the knowledge settled uneasily in her chest as she called the next passenger forward, her voice steady but her thoughts anything but. And around her the atmosphere remained altered, subtle but undeniable, the staff more cautious, their movements more measured, their eyes occasionally flicking toward the corridor as if expecting something or someone to return. And it was in that strained normalcy that the tension shifted again, not outward this time, but inward, directed at her, because the way her supervisor watched her had changed, no longer just concerned, but calculating, as if weighing risk, as if reconsidering her place in a system that suddenly felt far less stable than it had an hour ago. And after a few more passengers passed through the gate, he stepped closer once again, his voice controlled but firm. Finish this group, he said quietly. Then step away from the counter. And Emily glanced at him, confusion tightening her expression, because stepping away mid-shift was not standard procedure, not unless there was a problem. And the realization that she might be that problem sent a sharp pulse of unease through her. But she nodded anyway, because arguing now would only make things worse, and she moved through the next few passengers with mechanical precision, scanning, directing, maintaining the professional composure she had built over years of necessity, even as the weight of what was coming pressed closer with each passing second. And when the final passenger in that group cleared the gate, the supervisor placed a hand lightly on her arm, guiding her away from the counter toward a quieter corner, near the service corridor, away from the immediate flow of travelers. And the moment they stepped out of the main line of sight, his expression hardened, the concern giving way to something more direct, more serious. "Do you understand what you just did?" he asked, and this time it was not a question meant to be answered casually. It was an assessment, and Emily met his gaze, her own uncertainty tempered by a growing frustration. Because she had done her job, she had enforced the rules she was trained to enforce, and yet now she was being treated as if she had crossed some invisible boundary. "I followed procedure," she said, her voice steady but edged with quiet tension, and he shook his head immediately. "Procedure does not apply to him," he replied, and there it was again, that same unsettling idea, that there were exceptions she had never been taught, rules that existed beyond the official ones. And Emily felt something tighten inside her, not fear this time, but resistance. Because if procedure did not apply to certain people, then what exactly was she expected to enforce? What exactly was her role? And before she could respond, another figure approached, this one not in a standard uniform, but in a darker suit, tailored, precise, someone who did not belong to the visible structure of airport staff. And the moment he stepped into their space, the supervisor straightened instinctively, his posture shifting into something closer to deference, and the man's gaze moved directly to Emily, sharp and assessing, as if he had been looking for her specifically. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a quiet authority that made it clear he was not there for discussion. "Miss Carter," he said, and the fact that he knew her name without introduction sent a chill down her spine. "You are to remain available after your shift," he continued. "Do not leave the premises until you are instructed otherwise." And Emily stared at him, the words settling slowly, heavily, because this was no longer about a supervisor correcting an employee. This was something else entirely, something that reached beyond her job, beyond her understanding, and she opened her mouth to ask why, to demand some explanation. But the man did not wait, did not offer clarification. He simply gave a slight nod to the supervisor and turned away, disappearing back into the flow of the terminal as if he had never been there, leaving behind a silence that felt far more deliberate than before. And Emily stood there, her thoughts racing, her sense of control slipping further with each passing moment, because whatever system she had believed governed her world had just shifted again, and this time, she was no longer just observing it, she was being pulled into it. Emily Carter stood frozen for a moment after the man in the dark suit disappeared into the crowd, his words echoing in her mind with a weight that refused to settle, because this was no longer about a mistake at work or a misunderstanding with a supervisor. This was something else entirely, something deliberate, something that had singled her out in a way she could not ignore. And as she slowly turned back toward the boarding counter, the world around her felt sharper, more defined, as if every sound and movement carried new meaning. And she tried to focus on what she could control, on finishing her shift, on maintaining the routine that had always grounded her. But even that felt distant now, overshadowed by the awareness that she was being watched, not in the obvious sense of security cameras or passing glances, but in a deeper, more unsettling way, as if her presence had been marked and recorded somewhere beyond her reach. And she returned to her position behind the counter, her hands steady as she resumed scanning boarding passes. But her thoughts were far from steady, turning over everything she had learned, everything she had witnessed, trying to make sense of it in a way that fit within the reality she understood, and failing, because nothing about this situation aligned with the world she had known up until now. And as the final passengers moved through the gate and the line thinned, the terminal began to quiet, the earlier tension fading into a strained normalcy. But beneath that surface calm, there was still a current of unease, a sense that something unresolved lingered just out of sight. And it was then that the boarding door at the end of the corridor opened again, not wide, not enough for general movement, but just enough for a single figure to step back into view. And Emily's attention snapped toward it instinctively, her breath catching slightly as she recognized him. Immediately, Lucien Vale, returning, not as a passenger rejoining the line, but as someone who had never truly left. And the moment he stepped into the terminal, the atmosphere shifted once more, subtle but undeniable, conversations quieting, movement slowing, the same invisible pressure settling over the space as before. And this time Emily did not question it, did not try to rationalize it away, because she had already seen what happened when he was present. She had already felt the way the world seemed to bend around him, and now he was walking directly toward her, his steps measured, unhurried, as if time itself adjusted to accommodate him. And her heart began to beat faster, not out of panic, but out of something she could not quite define, a mix of anticipation and unease that rooted her in place, because she knew, without being told, that this moment was meant for her, that whatever had begun earlier was not finished, and as he approached the counter, the supervisor took an instinctive step forward, as if to intervene, but Lucien did not even glance in his direction, and the supervisor stopped immediately, his movement cut short by nothing more than the absence of acknowledgement, and Emily found herself standing alone again at the center of his attention, just as she had been before, but this time the context was different. This time she knew who he was, or at least what he represented, and that knowledge settled heavily in her chest as he came to a stop directly in front of her, close enough that the quiet cold surrounding him brushed against her again, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them with a weight that made it impossible to ignore. And then, finally, he broke it, his voice low, calm, carrying the same measured tone as before, but now with something else beneath it, something intentional. "You did not step aside until you were told twice," he said, not accusing, not questioning, simply stating a fact. And Emily held his gaze, her mind racing, her instincts telling her to be careful, but something deeper refusing to let her shrink away, and she answered before she could overthink it. "Because the rule applies to everyone," she said, her voice steady despite everything. And for the first time, something shifted in his expression, not visible to anyone else, not dramatic, but there, in the slight narrowing of his eyes, in the almost imperceptible change in the way he regarded her, and the air between them seemed to still completely, as if the entire terminal had paused once again to witness what would come next, and in that moment, it became clear that this was no longer about a line, no longer about a mistake, but about something far more significant, something that neither of them had fully defined yet, but that was now impossible to avoid, because Lucien Vale had returned, not to pass through, but to face the one person who had treated him as if he were ordinary, and that alone had been enough to change everything. The silence that followed her answer did not feel empty. It felt heavy, deliberate, as if the air itself was waiting for his response. And Lucien Vale did not look away from Emily Carter, not for a second, because something in her words had settled deeper than he expected, deeper than a simple statement of principle should have reached, and for a man who had spent centuries surrounded by compliance, by carefully calculated behavior, by people who adjusted themselves instinctively to his presence, this was not just unusual, it was disruptive in a way that he could not immediately categorize, and that alone made it dangerous, not to him, but to the order he had maintained for so long. And as he studied her, really studied her now, not as a passing curiosity, but as something that required understanding, he became aware of something else, something far more subtle than her defiance, something that did not belong to her behavior, but to her presence itself, a faint, almost imperceptible rhythm beneath the surface of her being, and for a fraction of a second, his expression shifted, not visibly to those around them, but enough that the stillness in the air tightened further, because what he sensed did not align with what she appeared to be, and his gaze lowered slightly, not in submission, but in focus, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear, and Emily felt it immediately. That shift in his attention, the way his presence seemed to close in around her without him moving any closer, and her breath caught again, not from fear alone, but from something unfamiliar, something that felt like being seen in a way she had never experienced before, not judged, not dismissed, but recognized, and she did not understand why that unsettled her more than anything else. And then it happened, so quickly that she almost missed it. The smallest contact, the edge of her hand brushing against the surface of the counter where his fingers rested, a simple, accidental touch that should have meant nothing. And yet the moment it occurred, the effect was immediate and undeniable, a sharp, invisible jolt that ran through the space between them. Not physical, not something that could be seen, but something that both of them felt with absolute clarity, and Lucien's hand stilled completely, his entire body going rigid for a fraction of a second before he forced it back into controlled stillness. But the damage, if it could be called that, had already been done, because whatever that contact had triggered, it was not normal, not human, and not something he had experienced in a very long time. And Emily pulled her hand back instinctively, her eyes widening slightly as she tried to process what she had just felt, because it had not been pain, not exactly, but it had been intense, like touching something charged, something alive in a way she could not explain, and the air around them seemed to react as well, the faint hum of the terminal faltering for a brief moment, lights dimming just enough to be noticed, and a nearby monitor flickering before stabilizing again, and behind them, one of the staff members took an involuntary step back, his face tightening as if he had felt a distant echo of whatever had just passed between them, and Lucien slowly lifted his gaze back to hers. But now there was something entirely different in his eyes, something that had not been there before, not just interest, not just recognition, but a deeper, more dangerous awareness, as if a truth he had long buried had just been forced back to the surface. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter than before, but carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "That should not be possible," he said, not to her, not entirely, but as if he were confirming something to himself, and Emily stared at him, confusion and unease mixing in her expression, because she had no idea what he meant, no idea what had just happened, only that something had changed in a way she could not undo, and around them the tension surged again, stronger this time, because those who understood even a fraction of what had just occurred knew that this was no longer a simple encounter. This was something else entirely, something that reached into the past, into things that were not meant to resurface. And Lucien remained still for another moment, his mind moving through possibilities with a precision honed over centuries, rejecting each one as quickly as it formed, because none of them fit, none of them explained the reaction he had just experienced, and yet the evidence stood in front of him, undeniable, in the form of a woman who should have been ordinary, who should have passed through his world without leaving a mark, and had instead done the impossible. And as he looked at her, really looked now, the decision that formed in his mind was not one of dismissal or avoidance, but of pursuit, because whatever she was, whatever this connection meant, it could not be ignored, and he would not allow it to remain unexplained. And for Emily Carter, standing there with her heart beating faster than she could control, the realization began to settle that this moment, this single point of contact, had changed something fundamental, not just in him, but in her as well. And whatever came next would not be something she could simply walk away from. Emily Carter could still feel the echo of that contact lingering in her hand, a faint warmth beneath her skin that refused to fade, and no matter how she tried to steady herself, no matter how she told herself it had been nothing more than a strange moment brought on by stress and exhaustion, the memory of it remained vivid, too precise, too real to dismiss. And across from her, Lucien Vale had not moved. Not in any way that would draw attention, but there was a subtle shift in the stillness that surrounded him, a deeper focus, as if every detail of her presence had been brought into sharp clarity. And for the first time since this encounter began, the balance between them changed, because he was no longer observing her from a distance, no longer treating her as an unexpected anomaly to be noted and forgotten. He was engaged, fully, deliberately, and that alone altered the space around them in a way that could not be ignored. And without another word, he reached into his coat once more, not for a boarding pass this time, but for something smaller, a thin black card with no visible markings, and he placed it gently on the counter between them, the motion controlled, intentional, as if the act itself carried weight beyond its simplicity. And Emily's eyes dropped to it instinctively, her brows drawing together in confusion, because there was nothing on it, no name, no logo, nothing that identified its purpose. And yet the moment it touched the surface of the counter, the same subtle reaction occurred, the faint flicker of the nearby screen, the slight hesitation in the hum of the terminal systems, as if even the environment recognized it. And when she looked back up at him, his gaze had not shifted. "You will stay after your shift," he said, his voice low, steady, leaving no room for misunderstanding. And it was not a request, not framed as one, but neither was it a command spoken with force. It was something else, something that carried certainty without needing to assert it. And Emily felt a flicker of resistance rise in her chest, instinctive, immediate, because everything in her life had taught her to question situations that did not make sense, to protect what little control she had. And she opened her mouth to respond, to push back, to ask why, but the words caught before they fully formed, because there was something in his expression now, something that made the question feel irrelevant, not because it did not matter, but because the answer would not change what had already been set in motion. And behind her, her supervisor shifted again, his presence tense, uncertain, as if he wanted to intervene but did not dare to. And that alone told her more than any explanation could have, because the man who had just minutes ago been ready to correct her was now silent, deferential, waiting, and that silence carried its own kind of pressure, and Emily swallowed, her thoughts racing as she weighed her options, as she tried to understand what refusing would mean, what accepting would mean, and whether she even had a choice at all. And as that realization settled in, the sense of being pulled into something beyond her control deepened, not with violence or force, but with inevitability, and she glanced down at the card again, then back up at him, her voice quieter now, but still steady. Why? She asked, because even if she could not stop what was happening, she needed to understand it, needed some piece of clarity to hold on to. And for a brief moment, something almost unreadable crossed his expression, something that might have been consideration, or something older, something tied to the reaction he had felt when their skin touched. And when he answered, his words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. Because you already crossed the line that separates my world from yours, he said, and the words settled into the space between them with a quiet finality, and Emily felt a chill run through her, not from the cold that surrounded him, but from the meaning behind what he had said, because she understood, in that moment, that this was not about her job, not about the airport, not about rules or procedures. This was about something much larger, something she had stepped into without realizing it. And there was no clear path back, and Lucien watched her for one more second, as if giving her time to absorb that truth. And then, without waiting for agreement or refusal, he turned, his movement as controlled as everything else about him, and walked back toward the corridor, leaving the card behind on the counter, a small, unmarked object that now felt heavier than anything she had ever been handed. And Emily Carter stood there, staring at it, her heart beating steadily, but her world no longer the same, because whatever line she had crossed, whatever boundary she had unknowingly stepped over, it was clear now that she could not simply return to where she had been before, and the choice in front of her was no longer whether to get involved, but how deeply she was already entangled. Emily Carter did not pick up the card right away, because touching it felt like accepting something she did not yet understand, and for a few seconds she simply stared at it where it rested on the counter, small and unmarked, yet somehow heavier than anything she had held before, and around her the terminal had returned to motion, passengers continuing to board, announcements resuming. The steady rhythm of travel re-establishing itself as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But beneath that surface normalcy there was still a quiet tension, a subtle awareness that lingered in the glances of the staff and the careful distance people seemed to keep from the space where Lucien Vale had stood, and Emily felt it most in the silence of her supervisor, who no longer tried to correct her, no longer offered instruction, but simply watched, waiting, as if he understood that whatever decision she made next was not something he could influence. And that realization settled into her slowly, because it meant that this moment belonged entirely to her, that whatever came after would not be guided by procedure or policy, but by a choice she had to make without understanding the full consequences. And she drew a slow breath, steadying herself the way she had learned to do in moments of uncertainty, and then, finally, she reached out and picked up the card, and the instant her fingers closed around it, the sensation returned, not as sharp as before, but unmistakable, a quiet pulse that moved through her hand and up her arm, like something recognizing her touch, and she inhaled slightly, her grip tightening for a fraction of a second before she forced herself to remain still, because reacting would only draw attention, and she could not afford that, not now, not with everything already shifting around her. And she slipped the card into the pocket of her uniform, the movement small but significant, because in doing so she had accepted something, whether she intended to or not, and the weight of that acceptance settled in her chest as she returned her attention to the remaining tasks of her shift, finishing the boarding process with a focus that bordered on mechanical, her actions precise, controlled, as if maintaining that structure could keep the uncertainty at bay. And eventually, as the final passengers moved through the gate and the terminal quieted, the official end of her shift arrived, marked not by any announcement but by the absence of responsibility. The moment when there were no more tasks to complete, no more passengers to assist, and under normal circumstances, she would have gathered her things and left without hesitation, eager to escape the noise and exhaustion of the day. But now she remained where she was, because leaving was no longer an option she believed she had. Not after what she had been told, not after the way the man in the dark suit had spoken to her, not after the card now resting in her pocket. And as the other staff members began to disperse, their movements cautious, their conversations quiet, Emily stayed behind, her presence alone at the counter feeling both exposed and strangely deliberate, as if this stillness was part of something larger. And minutes passed, stretching longer than they should have, the space around her growing quieter with each passing moment, until the terminal beyond the gate felt distant, almost separate. And it was in that quiet that she became aware of a new change, not in the crowd, not in the sound, but in the air itself, the same subtle cold returning, not as intense as before, but enough to be felt, enough to signal that she was no longer alone. And she did not need to turn immediately to know who had returned, because there was only one presence that carried that kind of stillness, that kind of quiet authority. And when she finally did turn, her movements slow, deliberate, she saw him standing at the far end of the now empty boarding corridor, no longer blending into the environment, no longer concealed by the movement of the crowd, but clearly visible, clearly focused. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the distance between them filled with something unspoken, something that had been building since their first exchange and had now reached a point where it could not be ignored. And Emily felt her heartbeat steady rather than race, a strange calm settling over her as she met his gaze, because whatever fear she had felt earlier had been replaced by something else, something quieter but stronger, a recognition that this moment was inevitable, that it had been moving toward her from the second she had told him to step back in line. And as he took a single step forward into the light, the space between them seemed to narrow not just physically but in a way that felt deeper, more final. And Emily Carter understood, without needing to be told, that the life she had known up until this point had already begun to slip behind her, and whatever waited ahead would not follow the rules she had lived by, but something far older, something she was only just beginning to glimpse. Lucian Vale stepped fully into the light, and for the first time since their paths crossed, there was no crowd, no noise, no system in motion to obscure what he was, because in the quiet of the empty boarding gate, the truth of his presence became unmistakable, not in any visible transformation, but in the way the air itself seemed to still around him, as if the world had chosen to pause rather than interfere. And Emily Carter stood her ground, her hands at her sides, her posture steady, not because she fully understood what she was facing, but because she had already made her choice the moment she refused to step aside. And that choice had led her here, to this exact moment, where there was no one else to intervene, no rule to enforce, only a conversation that would define what came next. And Lucian stopped a few feet in front of her, close enough that the quiet cold surrounding him settled into the space between them, but not close enough to dominate it. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke, because words, for once, were not the most important thing. And then he broke the silence, his voice lower than before, but clearer, stripped of anything unnecessary. "You felt it," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation, and Emily did not pretend otherwise. She nodded once, slowly, because denying it would serve no purpose now, and he watched her for a second longer, as if measuring the weight of that honesty. And then he continued, "So did I," and that was the first real shift, not in power, but in truth, because whatever existed between them was no longer one-sided. It was shared, undeniable, and Emily took a breath, steadying herself before she spoke. "What is happening?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm, because she needed clarity, needed something solid to hold on to in a situation that had moved far beyond anything she could have imagined. And Lucian's gaze did not waver as he answered, You carry something that should not exist anymore, he said, and the words settled into her with a weight that felt both foreign and familiar, as if part of her had always known there was something different, something she could not explain, and before she could respond, he stepped closer, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with a controlled certainty that closed the remaining distance between them, and this time, when his hand reached out, it was not accidental, it was deliberate, and his fingers brushed lightly against her wrist, and the reaction was immediate, stronger than before, a surge of energy that moved through both of them, sharp and undeniable. And Emily gasped softly, her other hand instinctively gripping the edge of the counter to steady herself, while Lucien's control held firm. But his eyes shifted, the calm surface breaking just enough to reveal something deeper, something that had been buried for centuries, recognition, not of her as she was now, but of something tied to her, something that connected her to a past he had long since closed off. And when the moment passed, when the energy settled back into a quiet pulse beneath the surface, he did not pull away immediately, as if confirming that what he had felt was real. And then, finally, he released her, stepping back just enough to restore the space between them, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried a clarity that had not been there before. There are forces in this world that most people never see, he said, and you just crossed into one of them. And Emily swallowed, the reality of that statement settling into her, not as fear, but as understanding, because everything that had happened, every moment since she had told him to step back in line, now aligned into something coherent, something that made sense in a way her previous life never had. And she looked at him, really looked this time, not as a powerful man, not as someone above the rules, but as someone who existed within a different set of them entirely. And for the first time, she did not feel small in comparison. She felt seen, equal in a way she could not explain. And Lucien seemed to recognize that shift as well, because something in his posture changed, not lowering, not diminishing, but adjusting, as if acknowledging her presence on a level he had not granted anyone in a very long time. And after a brief silence, he spoke once more. You have two choices, he said. Walk away now, and forget this ever happened, or come with me, and learn what you are. And the simplicity of it cut through everything else, because despite all the complexity, all the unknowns, it came down to a decision she could understand. And Emily Carter stood there, feeling the weight of both paths, the life she had known on one side, predictable, controlled, limited, and the unknown on the other, vast, uncertain, but undeniably real. And after a moment that stretched longer than it should have, she made her choice, not out of fear, not out of pressure, but out of the same quiet strength that had led her here in the first place. I am not walking away, she said, her voice steady, unwavering. And something in Lucien's expression settled at that, not satisfaction, not relief, but something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of a long-awaited answer. And he gave a slight nod, turning toward the corridor once more, but this time, when he moved, it was not alone, because Emily stepped forward beside him, leaving the counter, the terminal, and the life she had known behind without looking back. And as they walked into the shadowed passage that led beyond the visible world of flights and schedules, one truth became clear above all others, that the moment she had refused to step aside had not been a mistake. It had been the beginning of everything.